I'm Scott Lucas. This is today's EAWorldView on Syria. Was there a massacre at Maan? Last weekend, we carried the story of an insurgent victory in the village of Maan in Hama province. The opposition fighters had overrun the area, defeating pro-Assad militia and other Syrian forces. That might have been the end of the story had it not been for Syrian state media, which within 24 hours was claiming that the insurgents had massacred civilians in the village. There were no photographs. There was no video. There was just the assertion. But the story was propelled further by another twist. An outfit called the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, a small group of people in Coventry in Britain, started putting forth the claim as being accurate. They said specifically that at least 20 civilians had been amongst 40 people killed during the insurgent victory. Now, the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights never gave a source for this claim. It merely claims it has a network of people on the ground inside Syria. That claim was still enough, however, for the mainstream media to recycle it as confirmed. In other words, not that there might have been a massacre, but that there actually had been a massacre. Still, no further evidence. Just Syrian state media and the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights saying something must have happened. Insurgents put out a 15-minute video. Inevitably, they said there had been no massacre. They had confronted, killed, detained pro-Assad militia in the village. Yes, they had killed at least a few women, but those women, they claimed, had picked up arms and were firing on them. In other words, the insurgents said these were casualties of war. They were not civilians who had actually been massacred. Beyond the claim of the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights and beyond the insurgent video, there's one other piece of evidence. A group of independent journalists on Twitter who initially said, yes, there had been a massacre of civilians. However, as they put out their evidence, they really stood on only one photograph, backed up by what they claimed was a source in Maan of an elderly couple who had been killed by opposition fighters. What's the truth here? Well, the truth here is that in war, there may have been civilian casualties. There may have been people who were caught in crossfire. There may have been people who were killed, in however many instances, by insurgents who were infuriated by the fight. We simply don't know. Saying that you don't know is far different from saying, in fact, that there was a massacre. It is irresponsible. Indeed, it serves a much different purpose when you put out that claim as confirmed. On Monday, as the Geneva II conference resumed, the Assad delegation said, we don't want to talk about a transitional governing authority. We want to talk first and foremost about terrorism. What terrorism, they were asked. They said, well, let's look at the terrorism in Maan, in Hama province, where scores of civilians were killed by insurgents. That's what this conference is here to resolve. Not President Assad's future, not the future of a new government for Damascus. When the mainstream media claims there were massacres, in fact, says there were definitely massacres, it feeds into that propaganda line. That doesn't reduce the fact that civilians have been killed by insurgents. For example, in Latakia province during an offensive last August, Human Rights Watch found that scores of civilians were slain by, for example, the Islamic State of Iraq and the Sham. But it does not necessarily mean that these were systematic massacres, that indeed the main story in Syria is terrorism, is extremist. Because as the Syrian regime was putting out its claim of massacres, as the media was repeating the unconfirmed reports from an outfit based in Britain, there were indeed confirmed cases of not just scores, but hundreds of civilians being killed. In Aleppo, in Daraya, the Damascus suburb, across Syria, by barrel bombs and other explosives dropped from the air. It is that story that lies behind the claim at Geneva II from the opposition that President Assad does not have legitimacy. And it is that story that the Syrian state media and the Assad regime is trying to cover up by saying, look over there, there's a massacre. I'm Scott Lucas, and this is today's EAWorldView on Syria.